So let's see, you know, I come up with these really, what I think are really clever themes when I think about what my talks are going to be for a given month, a given period. And so I was really excited about 2020 spirituality. But what I realized is that that kind of relies on it being in written form. What I was wanting to sort of play off was the idea of, you know, when you take a vision test at the optometrist, the 20/20 vision, so it needs like a 20/20 to really make the point. But the idea is essentially that as we get our focus right in this time in 2020, the year is a crazy year for all of us. But as we get our focus right, the idea is that we can recognize that there is a spiritual dimension to every aspect of our lives. Everything that we do in our everyday lives has its grounding in the spiritual realm and spiritual purpose. And so for us to be able to sort of focus in on recognizing that, even in the moments that we're going through it, is a powerful way that we can sort of keep developing our spiritual practice and our spiritual maturity. So that was kind of the intention around it. And then today, what we're going to be looking at is how relationships, that not any specific relationships, but how relationships in general in our lives are one of the most powerful channels through which we can begin to express ourselves spiritually, and that we can begin to recognize that God's everywhere present in all things. Sometimes we don't want to claim that, you know, that it's all a good thing. But what we know and recognize is that within that, regardless of the circumstance or the situation, within that, there is always a potential for a greater expression of love. So that's what we're going to be looking at today, is just the incredible capacity that we have to look at relationships, to sort of witness what's happening in the connections we have with others, and call forth the spiritual dimension of it, the connectivity of it. So I'm going to start I was just really moved and touched by an article I saw in the Washington Post this week, or actually scrolling through my feed. I don't get a physical paper anymore, but, and it was called The Human Cost of the $20 Burger. And what it essentially does is, y'all, I'm sure are familiar with the prayer of Thanksgiving, or it's often said before a meal, where we give thanks for all of the ways in which others have sort of touched our food supply, right? That from the farmer who grew it to the trucker who brought it, to the packaging people who processed it, to how it gets to our table in the grocery. There's like this whole system that's in place for us to be able to enjoy the fruits of the field on our tables. This article was essentially the same thing, but it talked about how coronavirus, how this pandemic has really affected those who are charged with our food supply over the course of these last months. And I just found it to be this kind of beautiful demonstration of the ways in which we are all far more deeply connected and intimately connected than we're sometimes aware of. And I apologize. I know there are those of you among us who are vegans and vegetarians and would rather not hear about meat processing. But this isn't really a story about beef. It's really a story about the people who are part of the process that brings that to our tables, right? So it starts with a rancher, fourth generation rancher, who 2 years ago used artificial insemination to breed a steer that was going to eventually be a part of this burger that would be delivered in the course of this story. And it talks about really the toll that the virus and the shutdowns have taken even on that fourth generation farmer. How thousands of dollars a day he's losing as the supply chain sort of breaks down, and he now feeds cattle for far longer than he expected, and the cattle that he's feeding are getting fatter than would be ideal for the market conditions. And so he's losing all this money, and you get a picture of what that's like for his family and for his employees, and what that means for the legacy of the family. And next we move on to the processing plant, where we all know the conditions there are workers working very closely together and being at high risk of contagion. And the article traces the story to an immigrant mother who moved here a couple of years ago from Mexico as a registered nurse to escape an abusive husband. So she's been in this country for a while. She found that her nursing degree did her no good in this country, and so She tried a couple of jobs, childcare and pet sitting, but found that the most lucrative for her to be able to really care for her young son was working at this meatpacking plant. And of course, she contracts the virus and takes it home to her aunt who she's staying with and her young son. It talks about sort of her journey back to health and ultimately her choice to need to go back to work to care for family, even though she's in this kind of environment that most of us probably wouldn't choose. And the story then moves to a wholesaler outside of Boston. It's also, this is like a family legacy business. And this guy has established a reputation around the country as sort of top quality beef for restaurants and for grocery stores. And what we find is that he's now paying more for lesser quality beef. And he's working with his employees to sort of keep them on the payroll. And he's moving through all these challenges and spending way more money and spending lots of time on the phone with his customers and restaurants who had committed to making these purchases that now, because they're closed, they can't. And so there's sort of this, how he's moving through that and how he's dealing with the situation. And then ultimately we moved to a very high-end restaurant in Washington, D.C. that had closed for a while, and it had to lay off staff. But we were looking at, or we're speaking with the chef who's actually grilling up this burger that's going to go out as a takeout order. And the man who is grilling the burger was a sous chef formerly, which is a much higher paid position. But in order to maintain an income, he took a lesser job at a lower pay grade to be one of the few who was able to come back to the restaurant and work during this time. So all through the course of, we see how the impact of this has really touched all of us. And ultimately we see the burger being delivered. And again, the delivery person has her own sort of trade-offs that she's making in order to do well for her family, and recognizing that there's a trade-off between the risk that she's taking for exposure to the virus and the money that she's able to make to bring home to pay the bills. And it ends up being delivered at a brownstone in Georgetown, right? So a high sort of affluent area where there is a young man in his 30s who's an engineer who's been able to sort of segue nicely into working from home throughout the time. And the way that he's sort of dealing with the isolation is to kind of treat himself and occasionally ordering from a high-end restaurant that he normally probably wouldn't. And you end up with this kind of weird sense of compassion for everybody who's involved in that whole piece along the way, right? There's a whole system and structure in place that we're all sort of invested in that ultimately connects us in ways that we might not fully be cognizant of. And the reason I share this story is because those, I thought the reporter did a brilliant job of sort of drawing out the connections there. But beyond that, and more deeper than the way that we can articulate and describe those, there's a deeper spiritual connection that unites us all. And it's a connection that I think as we, as consumers, as we, as a part of these systems, become more consciously aware of, that we can bring a different intention to how we're going to show up, right? The world is being recreated as we know it through this time. And each of us has the ability and the capacity to bring forth a more loving and compassionate and just and equitable world by the choices, the intentions that we hold. I mean, I'm not just talking about what we can do sort of physically in terms of voting and in terms of protesting and in terms of that stuff. I'm talking about at the spiritual dimension, how we can come from a place and a space in our own hearts that arises purely out of a sense of love and compassion. Yeah. Excuse me. I want to share here, and here's another sort of reading that I found that I think is helpful for understanding the importance of this connection, right? This is by a kind of mystic who was aboard a train, riding a train in the rain. And you know how when you're looking out a window and there's rain streaming down it, there are little droplets that kind of get pushed around by the wind. And he's very cognizant of these droplets sort of being pushed together so that they're united in one form. And it turns into a whole thing for him, a whole sort of different way of understanding the connectedness of all things. So I want to share with you his observation around that. He says, simply by that momentary touching, this is the two drops coming together, neither was what it had been before. And as each one went on to touch other raindrops, it shared not only itself, but what it had gleaned from the other. I saw this metaphor many years ago, and it is one of my most vivid memories. I realized then that we never touch people so lightly that we do not leave a trace. Our state of being matters to those around us. So we need to become conscious of what we unintentionally share so that we can learn to share with intention. So that's what I'm wanting to suggest around this connection with relationships, right? To be very conscious about the energy that we're bringing into all of the interactions and connections that we share in relationship. I think Jesus has a great deal to say with it. You know, last week I shared about how Jesus was tired. This week I'm sharing about how Jesus was angry. I'm really interested in, because I think in these kind of extreme times, it calls us to move away from the images of Jesus that we find so comfortable, you know, the ones where he's comforting little children and he's calling them to us and he's always coming from light and love. Spiritual power doesn't always express that way. There are times when anger is perhaps a more powerful way to bring forth a greater degree of truth, right? To express that. And so I want to share a story. This is out of the book of Mark, where Jesus is really, I think, calling us to look carefully around us and at how we're showing up and that the relationships we have so that we can come from a more conscious place. This is Mark chapter 3. Again, he entered the synagogue. This is Jesus entering the synagogue. And a man was there who had a withered hand. They watched him to see whether he could cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. Okay, the they here is the Pharisees and Sadducees, right? The haters. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come forward." Then he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. He looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at their hardness of heart and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. So what do we do with that one, right? That seems like kind of a mixed piece. Here's what I want to suggest, as always, when we're talking about sort of biblical truth expressed in the Bible, we know that the characters and the circumstances are all aspects or dimensions of our own spiritual unfolding, our own understanding, right? So the comfortable characters in here for us to assume are one, Jesus, right? We're all, you know, team Jesus. Yes, Jesus heals. Yes, he is light and love. Yes, he calls out for healing and for wholeness. And we get that. We want to be connected to that same capacity in our own lives. We want to be able to be that agent through which light and love express and restoration and wholeness are restored. All of that. That's, you know, we get that. We're on board with that. And I think to some degree, it's easy for us to also associate ourselves with a man with a withered hand, right? Withered hand being metaphor for whatever it is within us that we don't really want the rest of the world to see or to know. Those parts in us which are maybe injured, or those parts in us which aren't perfect that we try and hide, right? So we kind of get that, and we understand and want to summon the courage to be able to reach out our hand when asked, so that we too can be a part of that healing. That's a part of our story as well. But the interesting part for me, the part right now that I think we're all maybe called to look at it more deeply, is the haters, the Pharisees and Sadducees, right? Because that's an aspect of us too, right? And here's how I see that unfolding for us. Here's how I see that rolling out. All of us has our own perspective, our own sense of what is right and just, and our own sense of how the world ought to be unfolding and what ought to be happening, right? Some of that is baked in. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago when in this culture where racism is so endemic and we're all sort of brought up in it like fish in water, some of that's there within us that we're just kind of learning to. But unless we're aware of the places where that's actually fully operating, part of our operating system, our background, when we come into situations and we have a predetermined notion about how it ought to be, or how someone should be behaving, or what someone else ought to be saying and espousing and supporting, right? That's Pharisees and Sadducees. That's not being open to the miracle, right? The Pharisees and Sadducees came in with a point of view. They came in looking for something to be offended about, and however Jesus was going to show up. And what do we know about what we intend, what we hold in mind, is that if we're looking for it, we're going to find it. It's sort of how law works. If that's sort of the blinder that we have on, then our capacity to be available to the incredible miracle that's going to be unfolding right before us isn't there for us to see, right? And that's why I think the angry Jesus is a good model for us in this situation, right? The angry Jesus is not. What's interesting to me is he could have handled the situation in a lot of ways, right? The man with the withered hand probably was in the synagogue kind of surreptitiously. He would not really have been welcome with this defect in his physical body, right? He would have been kind of sneaking in. Probably was probably aggressively and assertively shaking hands with other people all the time that he's hiding the other one. But Jesus calls him out, right? Isn't that interesting? Jesus could have chosen another way to do this. He could have sent Peter out to like pull the man aside and just make sure he didn't leave. And at the end of the day, he could have healed the man in that way. But what Jesus recognizes, there was a structure in place. There was a mindset in place that even if the hand is healed, even if that structure's in place, we're just going to keep recreating the same crap. So Jesus calls it out systemically, right? In front of the whole assembly in the synagogue, he's calling it out and really recognizing that the structure, the expectation, the dogma that they were holding around what was appropriate behavior on the Sabbath was flawed, was corrupt, needed to be changed. And I think that's what we're called to do, is to recognizing the spaces in our own consciousness, in our own awareness, where we're bringing forth, calling forth what's not wanted in our experience because it's the way we think it ought to be and we want to have it, right? So here's how I want to sort of give us a little softer landing in terms of how we use relationships to create a greater sense of the sacred in our experience. I want you to first imagine someone who adores you, someone who unconditionally supports you, no matter what the experience. That when you're around this person, you feel totally uplifted. There's something within you that is called forth that is out of your highest and best self. Just rest in what that feels like, what that support is like. I was talking with a coach this week and was working on a problem that I've had a real difficulty sort of coming up with any kind of wisdom or answer about how to approach. And what I recognize is that in working with this coach, suddenly I'm like amazingly articulate. Like there was this wisdom that came forth and it was like, who said that? You know, that arises out of, sort of divine intelligence. When we're totally available, those kinds of experiences happen to us when we're totally available to what's highest and best in us. And others who are able to hold that space for us can sort of evoke it. And we can do the same for them, right? There are folks who we have that same capacity. So hold that now, that experience, whoever it is that supports you in that way. And I invite you now to call to mind someone else. And this person is sort of the opposite. This person is sandpaper to your very soul. that just the experience of being with them, it works your every nerve, right? They know just which buttons to push on you. In fact, they probably installed them. There's like this capacity. There is this person that has this ability to sort of have you shrink from your highest and best self. And yet that's who the haters are in the story with Jesus, right? That's coming in with the expectation of how I picture this interaction going down, and not being able to sort of let go to the possibility that there's a greater potential for healing. In fact, some of the greatest healing and restoration that happens in our lives happens through the folks who challenge us the most, yeah? So what I'd like to do as we prepare now for a time of meditation is just rest in the awareness that regardless of how we judge a particular relationship, it too is a part of our sacred journey to wholeness. Those relationships are a path through, as we bring our conscious intention and awareness to it, are a path for us to know our own greatness, to become who it is that we most want to be. I love the quote that the way that we're going to have the right people in our lives, the way that we're going to have a world that works for all, is for us to become the right people in our own hearts. So let's hold that in mind as we prepare now for a time of meditation. It's right here and right now where we can experience the very power of God that brings about healing and restoration at every level of being. It's right here and right now where we can connect with the strength and the courage and the love and the wisdom to be exactly who we were created to be, an expression of love and compassion and grace. We recognize that it's in the quiet times and reflection when we can sort of activate the power of God to operate throughout our life experience. And so we set an intention now to be completely open and available to Spirit, to be willing to see the spaces in our own hearts where there may be darkness or judgment. And without condemning that, with just simply through the power of acceptance and bringing light to it, we can actually allow it to transform. And so right here and right now, we accept that it's in our relationships, in our individual interactions, when the power of love can restore us and renew us, can take what was withered or shriveled and bring it into a sense of greater life, so that it might express as joy and compassion and peace. Right here, right now, we accept that that's not only our spiritual work, but it is also the blessing through which we can experience the gifts of Spirit more fully. As we become willing to see clearly, as we become willing to allow Spirit to uplift and renew us, then we step into a greater capacity of our own becoming of light, love, power, wisdom, intelligence. So now as we rest in just a moment of silence, I invite you to allow that process to unfold in you, however it is that you experience Spirit in this moment. Let it be the power that moves you toward deeper and more meaningful and more compassionate relationships at every level of being. In the silence. Gently now, as we prepare to bring our attention back from this kind of communal experience of the power of silence, we call forth gratitude and thanksgiving. Gratitude for this opportunity to join together in self-reflection and consciousness raising. Gratitude for the capacity to experience God's light and love moving through us collectively, and knowing that each of us is empowered to bring it forth individually. So it is, and so we let it be. Amen. Hey, thanks for watching this YouTube video. If Unity's message of positive spiritual living resonates with you, I hope you'll subscribe to our channel so you can stay up to date on other lessons as we post them. Also, if you're able to support us financially in the work that we do in the world, please check below for contact information. You can visit our website, find more about what programming we offer, as well as how to give. Blessings.